Heavenly Father, thank you for this chance to get together and learn of church history, of the sacrifices and dedication of the early church members, and to reflect on their sacrifice, their dedication, and your support of them, and find parallels with that in our own lives about how you are there with us at all times. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome for this final class as we complete our journey as we've gone from Pentecost to Constantine. As Jim's kind of alluded to, we are going to be ripping through a lot of history today. Our first class covered about 40 years, the second one about 70. Today we're 200 and change. So we're going to be going a little less into very specific detail in the way that we have been. Hopefully this will give you a good sense of kind of what happened in those couple of centuries leading up to Constantine and those grand reforms. So as always, if you do have questions, please feel free to put them into the chat. Jim is going to be monitoring, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity.
Matt, your audio keeps dropping out more than half the time, so I don't know.
That is most unfortunate. I'm going to go ahead. I'm in a different locale. I'm at the church, so I don't know if that's impacting at all. And I'll move the microphone a little closer. Is this better?
We'll see. I don't know.
We'll see. Okay. Well, I may have to take a journey around the church and find where the Wi-Fi is best then. So
Find where your hotspot is.
Yeah. Okay. Well, please feel free to let me know if there's a problem, and I'll try to fix this on my end. I'm not quite sure. But all right. Well, without further ado, then let's jump on in. So just a review for those of you who may not have been to our last few classes. This is kind of the overview of where we've been, and what we'll be focused on primarily are those three bolded sections at the bottom, talking about the early church fathers, about Roman persecution, sporadic at first, before getting increasingly intense in that 250 to 313 is a little inaccurate, about 306, 313 is when it officially ended. But then we'll also get into some of the reforms and the overall effect that Constantine had. So just a real quick summary of where we've been over these past couple of weeks. From what we can tell, the earliest Christians do seem to have held closely to Jewish practices like circumcision and dietary law. We looked at that kind of from that first decade right after Pentecost and before Paul's mission really started in earnest. But as time went on and the mission of the Gentiles continued to be successful, it did lead to questions as the church gradually grew increasingly Gentile, what it was that made converts Christian. Was it a connection to Jewish practice? Was it their faith in Jesus as Lord and Savior? And increasingly, the church began leaning in that direction of faith and belief rather than practice, culminating in 49 at the Council of Jerusalem, when it was officially decided amongst the pillars of the church, so Peter, James the Just, John, Paul, many other apostles. It was decided that Christians, these Gentile Christian converts, did not need to observe Jewish practices, such as circumcision, etc. As far as we know, though, the pillars and others still continue to observe these practices. More importantly, though, they were centered in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem still continued to function as the center of early Christianity. Continue to have audio problems, I'm seeing. All right, I apologize to you all. I'm going to go. You want to tour of the church as I walk through it and try to find a location that isn't cutting out. I'm going to do my best here. I'll try to walk and talk as I teach, which is always a fun thing. So you're going to get some movement as I try to find a place that I'm going to need to put a mask on too, now that I'm thinking about this.
Another way,
Matt, you're probably going to get a better signal in the Grad Center than here.
Yeah, that was where I was going to head on over to. So I apologize all. I'm not sure what's going on, but we'll do the best we can. So, you know, we had our first international adult ed class. This might be our first one where you're hearing someone walk and talk on the move. So we're the sort of itinerant church at the moment. So in any case, I'm going to keep moving on and try to keep us going. I hope you can hear me as I echo through the hallways. This is not what one would want. All right. So in terms of looking at our second class, there was an undercurrent of really intense anti-Roman sentiment amongst many Jews living in Jerusalem and beyond, and that eventually culminated in a revolt against Rome in the year 66. So here we go. This is hopefully going to move. All right, I can't catch a break today. I think I might try and teach you all from a hall.
Nancy, your audio's on.
Thank you.
Matt, should I email Michael?
Perhaps, like I said, I'm going to try to go into, I'm going into the Borwell dining room now, and hopefully being in the grad center, we'll have our Wi-Fi in a little better shape.
Sounds better.
It sounds better already. It looks like Neil's ministry is in here though. All right. How about for old times, say, hey, Leon, how about for old time's sake, I take us up to the 5th floor. Does that sound good?
Okay.
All right. My deep apologies to you all. Yeah, this is unfortunate, but. All right.
Well, next time, maybe a dedicated mic or something would work too. Not the wireless mic, but maybe a mic plugged into the laptop.
Okay.
I don't know.
All right. All right. So here we are, 5th floor of the grad center. And let me know, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So take 2. Thank you everyone for your patience. I really appreciate it. So getting back to talking about what we learned in the last class, we talked about that revolt against Rome that eventually really led to the absolute destruction and collapse of Jerusalem, of the temple in Jerusalem, but also the destruction of the early church, so James the Just, leaders there. And from that point on, early Christianity became somewhat decentralized during that time period. It was out of that, and one of the new ways that there began to be sort of a sense of coherence and connection from these sort of far-flung house churches was a handful of writings. Paul's epistles, this was the time period when the Gospels were being developed and written, along with a handful of other early church writings. It was also during this time that the church began transitioning from sort of a communal ruling elders, the presbyter is the Greek word. It began transitioning from that to a much more structured episcopal governance structure, meaning one that's led by bishops. And so there would be a bishop within a particular region that would oversee instruction for those churches. And that model would continue to grow as time went on. We ended with Marcion, who was excommunicated from the church in Rome in the year 144. Marcion, in very brief terms, was someone who only held to parts of the Gospel of Luke and some of Paul's epistles, and had some other kind of bolder ideas about what Christianity was. Eventually was excommunicated by the bishop in Rome. And it really serves as sort of a pivot point of recognizing that there was a degree of centralized authority by the reasons, both from bishops leading, but also understanding what would be quote unquote canon, even though that canonization process wouldn't become official until the time of Constantine. So that's what we've been the last few weeks. Today, we are going to be really covering hard what is called the ANTE-NICENE era, which is the period from right at the tail end of the apostolic age. The death of John he's believed to have lived until around 100. And so he marks the last living connection with Jesus, of someone who had heard Jesus's ministry. And so from this point on, these are all whether you want to call it a second generation, third generation of Christians moving beyond this point. We talked about in our last class the idea that apostolic sees, so meaning places or cities where the apostles had founded churches. So these would be places like Rome, Ephesus, Antioch. These would become increasingly important and powerful voices. They continue to, not in the sense that the Pope had sort of this ultimate authority, but their voice certainly carried much more weight than just sort of offshoot Greco-Roman cities. Those apostolic sees would continue to be some of the most important voices, and we're going to cover some of those over the next few slides. One of the other things that really came to the fore, though, when we look at this era of Christianity, is that while early Christians spent a lot of time trying to define their relationship with Judaism and how connected it was, most disputes within the 2nd and 3rd century actually came from struggles with what we now call and know as Gnostic Christianity. Gnostic coming from a term gnosis, meaning knowledge. So what is Gnostic Christianity? There's if you're ever going to do a deep dive into this, there's a lot of fun. There's a lot of fun reading out there. We'll just touch on the very surface of it. Essentially, what Gnostic Christianity meant was that having a special set of knowledge is what leads one to salvation. Now, you may say that this sounds very similar to our faith or belief leading to salvation. I would agree with you to a point, but there were certainly distinctions within it, particularly when you start reading a little bit more into Gnostic writings. The way that I would put it and describe it is that it almost was a sense of personal enlightenment. For those of you who know Buddhism well, enlightenment was one of the primary goals, as well as this sort of light and dark, spiritual versus material. There was sort of this dualistic worldview that you saw start, I say the Persian connections here. You really see that with Zoroastrianism going way back into the 5th century BCE. But you get it much more in this time period with the Manichaeans and a few other sects of this idea that there are these two competing sides in this kind of grand kind of war between light and dark and the spiritual and the material world. It's believed that these sort of Gnostic undertones were around towards the end of the 1st century. Some scholars have noted that John's Gospel can sound Gnostic at times. If you think about the prologue, the John 1, it has a different sort of sense and feel than many of the other Gospels in the way that they're written. But the Gospel of John also goes out of its way sometimes to sound anti-Gnostic as well, and clearly was writing against it for being the only gospel to record Gospel of Thomas and kind of touching Jesus' wounds as sort of this pointed, Jesus's resurrection was not merely spiritual, it had a physical component as well. You see John emphasize that over and over again, which directly contradicted Gnostic teachings and later Gnostic teachings. In fact, it was one of the reasons why Marcion was really against John's Gospel. So all that to say, we don't need to get too deep in the weeds in Gnostic Christianity. It was one of the interesting pieces is that prior to 1945, this gets into the joy of archaeological discovery, there actually was extremely little known about it other than what early Christian writers were writing against. Our only window into what Gnostic Christianity was what the church was arguing against. And so we were trying to reconstruct worldviews based on that. But a discovery in Egypt, the Nag Hammadi community, really led to an incredible wealth of material. It's believed that it may have been a community of Gnostics who either hid or stored their writings in this location. And were saving them essentially from destruction. As far as we know, there was a concerted effort to destroy Gnostic writings and to sort of remove them. But this gave a sort of window into that. You may have heard of the Gnostic Gospels before in Elaine Pagel's book, but the term gospel really the writings are much more broad than that. Some are about the life and ministry of Jesus. There's several infancy gospels about Jesus, kind of talking about his early life. The most notable of these is often said to be the Gospel of Thomas, which has potential claims to being one of the earliest texts written, potentially even in the 1st century. It has no narrative whatsoever, but is written as a collection of sayings from Jesus, some of which actually do have connections to the Gospels, others of which sound much more mystical. There's some questions about whether or not this developed over time, but in any case, the Gospel of Thomas was and is probably one of the more important discoveries from this. Most of them we would just kind of qualify as so out there as to be almost unrecognizable. I give you one nice little quote from one of them that can help give you the sense of the mystical feel of this. The perfect Savior hath said, "Come you from things unseen into the end of those that are seen, and from the very emanation of thought shall reveal unto you how faith in they which are unseen was found in them which are seen, that they belong to the unbegotten Father. Whomsoever hath ears to hear, let him hear." So if you understand that, I truly have no idea what we're going for there, but these were the sort of kind of mystical, spiritual sounding Enlightenment teachings present in Gnostic Christianity. It was a very sort of prominent, as far as we can tell, undertone, given how many of the early church fathers were writing against it. But over time, Gnostic Christianity began to sort of lose out to what we would know as Orthodox Christianity. The tab over here says Proto-Orthodox, so this is prior to Constantine really helping to get what is and what isn't Christian nailed down. But during this time period, there was a lot of development going on, and we see many of the early church fathers going through this. For them, they really emphasized, and you see this in the Gospels, that Jesus was both human and divine. The Gnostics really preached that Jesus was divine only, spiritual, and wasn't even a physical being. The Ebionites, which some scholars believe may have some connection to Jewish Christian communities, focused on Jesus as human, not divine whatsoever. And so what became Orthodox Christianity was sort of this space in between that we hold to the confusing paradox of Jesus was both human and divine. For these other two groups, they were on one side of that. Within this time period, we also continue to see church structure and governance be a really important emphasis and thing that keeps developing. And as we covered last week, this was also a time really when what we now know as the New Testament, that process of canonization and narrowing down was coming into place. So who were these early church fathers? I unfortunately will say they were fathers. There were unfortunately very few, or at least very few known about, church mothers, despite the fact that surely many must have existed in terms of being important within local house churches or things along those lines. But the leadership of the church in those 2nd and 3rd centuries and beyond continued to be male-led. So when we think about it, there are a few different kind of sections and phases. One is the Apostolic Fathers. The reason why they have that name is each of these were believed to have had a connection with one of the apostles and learned directly from an apostle. So that would be people like Clement of Rome, who we spoke of last week, who is really trying to make an argument about clergy authority within his letters. You have Ignatius of Antioch, who is one of the big proponents early on about this idea that Jesus is simultaneously both human and divine. And he is perhaps more than any other really clear about the roles that bishops will play in the early church. And so he stands as a very important figure in that. You also have Polycarp of Smyrna. Polycarp, it's a great name. But he represents part of this movement within the early church of celebrating martyrs and martyrdom, and this idea of believing so strongly in one's faith that you would die for it. We're going to get into that much more later as we get into persecutions and things along those lines. But Polycarp is often lifted up as one of the early examples of a martyr within the early church. You also have, for lack of a better description, you can use big air quotes on this, but the Greek fathers, so those who had some level of connection to that sort of Hellenistic thinking, and brought that mindset to the early church. You had Justin Martyr, who you may have heard the name before as a early Christian apologist or a defender of Christianity, who was very well known for addressing Roman critics. As Christianity began to grow, it was viewed with suspicion within the Roman Empire. One of the interesting things about how Rome treated new religions, something like Judaism, because it was ancient, was seen as a sort of accepted religion, even though it obviously didn't believe in the pantheon of gods. But new religions were often looked at within Rome through a lens of suspicion, particularly when, in the case of Christianity, they were lifting up one God, not just many. And they also were sort of preaching deference to God rather than to the emperor. That would become an important sticking point as we move forward as well. You have Irenaeus, who, as we talked about last week, was the first to clearly state that there are 4 gospels, no more nor less. And Irenaeus was also a great window into the Gnostic Christian world prior to the discovery at Nag Hammadi. He was writing against one of the really prominent leaders in the Gnostic Christian church, and a lot of his writings against that have survived. Finally, we also have Clement of Alexandria. Alexandria is in Egypt, but Clement seems to have had a great deal of training in Greek philosophy, and really a lot of his writings reflect that sort of mindset and bringing that sort of philosophical lens to the early Christian church. And then the other that I would lift up is the quote North African fathers. So this would be folks like Origen, who what an incredible writer he was. It's believed that he wrote over 2,000 works. If you just try to wrap your mind around that, it's absolutely incredible. And when we say works, down to one of his works was translating the entire Old Testament into several different languages. That was just one of his projects. You know, he had a lot of free time apparently, but an incredible producer of material. Interestingly, Origen, despite being what many look at as one of the great theologians of the early church, some of his writings ended up leading to what would, in subsequent centuries, become a major church controversy. And his writing and legacy was actually somewhat damaged and destroyed in that. Unfortunately, many of those 2,000 works that he wrote were seized and destroyed. And so, although we know of his, unfortunately, many of his works are unfortunately, they've been lost to history, barring a grand archaeological discovery. You also have Tertullian, who was connected to Carthage. He wrote very extensively in the way that Justin Martyr did as an early Christian apologist. And he is believed to have been the first to use the term the Trinity of Father, Son, Spirit, introducing that into the vernacular of the church. You also had Cyprian, who was a very important leader during the beginning of organized Roman persecutions against Christianity, eventually coalescing in him being a very public martyr for the faith and an inspiration for many. So I want to preface all this by saying this is a very zoomed out view. There were many incredible and important influential figures in this time period, so I fully recognize that, but I also want to make sure that we're able to get to Constantine. So I'm ended the church father portion here. Do we have any questions before I start to move on into the persecutions phase of things? Everyone's favorite topic, I know. Any quick questions? I'm just trying to scan around. All right, well, hearing none, we, unfortunately, I obviously am not going to go into any grand detail, but we're going to go into the Roman persecution of Christians, something many of us have probably heard of, but some of the details may actually surprise you a little bit. As far as we can tell, and as scholars can tell, there actually was never any sort of widespread organized persecution of the Christian church until about the mid-3rd century, and we'll get into what that was. We do know that Christians were killed for their faith. I mean, the Bible records Stephen very early on in the book of Acts as being stoned, persecuted, and martyred for his faith. But from that point on, much of what we can tell is that these were very specific and local instances. You probably know about, sorry, I'm jumping the gun a little bit. We obviously know that Paul and Peter and James were killed for their faith. Many of us know that Nero, know that name and Nero's persecution. One of the interesting pieces of that is based on all of the historical data we have, the Christian population in Rome can't have been very large, potentially 100 people, perhaps less. So it's assumed that Christians were killed by him, but the extent to which this was a wider organized persecution, there does not seem to be a great deal of historical evidence of that. It seems to have been some level of scapegoating individual Christians within the city of Rome at that time, rather than something that took place across the empire. As time continued to go on, there were specific instances of persecutions. The typical driver of this was that Christians would refuse to pay tribute to either the emperor or to the Roman pantheon of gods. One of the confusing, I mentioned the criticisms of Christians that develop within Rome. They are called atheists at varying points, which sounds funny to our ears until you think about Christians were denying the Roman pantheon of gods, and so they were seen as atheists. They were discussed as cannibals because they kept talking about this strange ritual in which they ate Jesus's body and blood. And so for Romans, they were highly concerned by this idea that they were, this person that they called Lord, they were eating his body and blood, so they were referred to as cannibals. There are also documents talking about how Christians practice incest. What they mean by that is the church keeps writing about that they are brothers and sisters in Christ and showing love to their brothers and sisters. And that became seen as sort of the sticking point of what are they talking about? And so there are all these sort of misconceptions, and you see Justin Martyr and Tertullian and all these other apologists trying to write against this. But this was sort of some of the suspicion that Romans, or at the very least Roman intellectuals, had about the church. This didn't necessarily mean that they were persecuted in any sort of organized way. There was just sort of a general wariness of Christians, particularly in those early years. That changed, however, under the reign of Decius, who was a Roman emperor around the mid-3rd century. Christianity did continue to develop in this time period, and it should be noted that the work of the early church fathers, those apostolic sees, was incredibly effective. Scholars believe there were perhaps as many as 1 million Christians by the time this persecution from Decius came to be. But in the year 250, he issued an edict as he sort of sought to coalesce his power and authority in his reign. He issued an edict demanding that all Roman citizens perform a sacrifice to the gods or else be put to death. As far as we know, and this is from reading his edicts and writings from advisors, he doesn't seem to have done this specifically against Christianity. But one of the unfortunate effects of this is that Christians were very strongly of the belief that they should not offer sacrifice either to the gods or to bow down to the emperor. And so from what we know, thousands of Christians in this time frame were executed. And because of their kind of collective resistance across the empire, Christianity began to be increasingly seen in Roman circles as a threat to both Roman authority as well as control. So this sort of increased to some degree. The next emperor did a similar thing. He even escalated it to asking that all Christian bishops be rounded up and executed within the year 257, leading to the death of many of those bishops while forcing others into hiding. Earlier I had mentioned Cyprian as sort of a important figure in this. So Cyprian from Carthage really kind of became emblematic of this, with a very public martyrdom and a very public proclamation of his faith, that he would refuse to bow down to the emperor. All of this sort of killing and mayhem really only seems to have lasted about for 1 decade at that time. So from about 250 to petering out as we near 260. Valerian's son Galenius was much more tolerant, and it was during this time, fascinatingly, that Christianity just exploded in popularity. I don't know if it was the notoriety of being willing to stand up to Rome and Roman authority, and if there was appeal in that. If there was this sense of, these people are so willing to die for their faith, it must be important to learn about. But as historical estimates go, it's believed that Christianity, within the span of 50 years, expanded from about 1 million Christians to potentially as high as 6, maybe even 7 million Christians during this time frame. It was a time of explosive growth. Unfortunately, the Emperor Diocletian took power, and he had a longer reign. But as they started moving into the 4th century, Diocletian really began a push to coalesce Rome around its former glory. And what that often meant was the same thing that Decius was doing and others. It was this focus on power and control, and to have nothing else put before Rome. And that, unfortunately, led to what is probably the most widespread persecution of Christians, particularly since they had expanded so much further in number. So around the year 300, Diocletian began removing anyone who was a publicly professing Christian from both the army as well as anyone holding a government post. So there's this sort of, we weren't into persecution yet, but sort of decentivizing being a Christian, that this would mean losing your post, your livelihood. There was sort of this purge of Christians because, as the understanding went, they could not be subsequently, or they could not be sufficiently loyal to Rome. In the year 303 was where all of this hit the fan, as it were. Diocletian ended up making an edict, an order, and a series of edicts, ordering the destruction of Christian buildings. So this is churches, any homes that would be gathering, any scriptures and written texts, for all of those to be burned and really destroyed. Later on in the following year, clergy were once again rounded up and given that choice to offer sacrifice to the emperor or to gods or face execution. And many were. It's impossible to say the exact number. The estimates once upon a time were in the tens of thousands. Scholars more recently have begun to question that. However, it almost certainly was in the thousands of not only just clergy, but Christians who died during this time period. And it really was a very focused 3-year span from about the year 303 to 306. This was sort of the peak of the Diocletian's persecution. However, in the year 305, Diocletian became ill, no connection to anything, but he was just old. Diocletian was forced to abdicate and step back from being emperor. And one of the interesting historical pieces of this was that Diocletian had previously separated, the Roman Empire had grown so large and vast that he had essentially split up the territory into a system of himself as leader and sort of other junior emperors is, I guess, the term that I would use to describe them, as sort of these, what scholars know as the tetrarchy, that this was sort of this structure of governance that he had created. When he stepped back, however, although he named a successor, it did lead to a sort of power vacuum within Rome during that time. And it was into this that a man by the name of Flavius Valerius Constantine'S was declared by his army, although I'm sure he didn't say no to it, was declared as the sole emperor by his army. And over the course of the next several years, even leading into the decades beyond, although it was most prominently at the front, a series of civil wars within Rome as there was this sort of fighting for power and control. And you may have already put the pieces together that this Flavius Valerius Constantine'S later would become known as Constantine I or Constantine the Great. And so we are going to be turning to him and some of what he sort of ushered in our final part of our class. So any quick questions before we dive into Constantine? All right, well, friends, hearing none. This is well, it's not an actual image of Constantine, but a depiction of him during one of the sort of really important moments in the early Christian movement. So Constantine, in the midst of fighting these wars and fighting for control, in the year 312, he won an incredibly decisive battle against his primary rival. And as it would later be recorded by Eusebius, that name that we've spoken of a few times now, his sort of chronicler and historian, Constantine would attribute this victory to a vision that he had, that his soldiers should paint the Chi Rho, which is the first two letters in Greek of Christ, onto their shields, and that would lead them to victory. This battle was one in which Constantine was outnumbered fairly significantly, and this was a real turning point in his ability to take control of Rome and the Roman Empire. As he began to coalesce this control, Constantine issued an edict, the Edict of Milan, that essentially removed the edicts that Diocletian had put in, demanding that Christians sacrifice to the gods or the emperor or be killed. Instead, Constantine essentially issued an edict of peace, that Christianity would no longer be persecuted in the Roman Empire. And as far as Eusebius's writings and other accounts from that time go, it seems to have been somewhere in this time period that he converted, and I use those air quotes very intentionally, and we get into questions about how sincere his conversion was. But he seems to have converted in this time period as well. So getting into questions about his conversion, one of the fascinating pieces is this still remains something of a historical mystery as to what it was that was Constantine's conversion genuine? Did he have this vision, or did he see this as a play in his wider construction of a new Roman Empire? So there are some who are skeptical that Constantine converted. Their primary reason that is often given is that he was doing this to unify allegiance to his rule, meaning that if you have a quickly growing group like Christians, thought to be perhaps 10% of the empire, persecutions didn't seem to be working, that this was sort of a way to bring them into the fold, as it were. Some evidence of this is that as Constantine continued to reign, rather than a sole adherence to Christianity, religious tolerance seems to have been one of his big drivers. As far as we know, he continued to lift up Roman gods. He would use pagan symbols on his coinage and things along those lines. And so many scholars look back at him as probably more of a syncretist, which is a term meaning they combine many different traditions, or at the very least don't see a problem with holding adherence to Christianity and adherence to sort of Roman pantheon. They don't see them as being at odds. So essentially the argument goes that Constantine was really just looking to add Christianity into the fold of the empire. I would argue, though, and many others have argued as well, that his conversion doesn't really make a lot of sense, though, when you start getting down to some of the nuts and bolts of it, even from a purely political calculus. As we'd already talked about, most of the early Christian movement, these were people who had just been removed from the military. There was kind of this purge within the political classes. As far as we know, most early Christians were from lower social classes, which wasn't primarily a group that Roman aristocracy often sought to recruit or do well by. Christianity at max was about 15% of the Roman Empire's population. I mean, we're not talking about a massive group. They were certainly a minority within Christianity. And so that question I have at the bottom, was there really a tangible benefit from him proclaiming that he was a Christian? There may be benefit to an edict of peace and to not have infighting, but to claim Christianity for himself seems to me that there was some level of a true conversion on his part, and that he really saw himself as a important figure and patron within early Christianity. To that patronage, the second bullet point, when he moved his capital from Rome to Constantinople, so further east, or what became known as Constantinople, he, as far as we know, personally patronized building several churches in that area, Christian churches. And so he, at the very least, seems to have had a very vested interest in Christianity's success. And so from my perspective and the perspective of others, there was at minimum some level of genuine conversion on his part. And so as part of his interest in Christianity and the early Christian movement, but also his very real interest in power and authority and a sense of unity, he began to start to bring together, as we've been talking about, those second and third centuries were really defined by infighting between what we would now know as Orthodox Christianity versus Gnostic Christianity. As we go into the 4th century, there's sort of this new dispute that arises with what's called the Arian controversy. Now, you hear the word Arian, you may think of like the Reich and all that. That's not what this has to do or what that has to do with anything. This was about a leader named Arius, who we'll get into a little bit about that in the coming slides. But as Constantine sort of took on this increasing authority and interest in sort of coalescing Christianity around a unified whole, in the year 325, he invited 1,800 bishops, all from across the Roman Empire, as far as Gaul, going up into France, and as far east as I believe, I know at minimum in Constantinople, but really to the edges of the Roman Empire, calling them to the city of Nicaea for what we believe was really the first sort of council of this sort since Peter and Paul and James gathered in that year 49 to make that consequential decision about Judaism and Christianity's connection. All told, it's believed that about 318 bishops were able to attend from across the Roman Empire. And what was at stake and what was being discussed at this was thinking about how Christianity understood the relationship between God and Jesus. So in a couple decades prior, Arius, who was a priest in Alexandria in Egypt, began insisting that because Jesus was, quote, begotten from God, that Jesus was not God. Essentially, it's something of a return to this Jesus is human, not divine, that question. And he used in part for his argument writings from Origen of Alexandria, that great 2000 work writer that I spoke of earlier. And so he began very loudly and publicly recruiting others within not only just Egypt, but eventually around the Mediterranean, began recruiting to his cause. In some ways, you could make the argument that he was trying to be like what Martin Luther was what Arius was trying to be within the 4th century. Arius was, and Arianism was met with resistance. One of the most loud and vocal people against him was Athanasius, who was sort of the second in command and eventually become in command of Alexandria as the head bishop. Athanasius, his argument was that God and Jesus were the same substance, and meaning that they were the same on every level. He would use texts like John 1, this sort of pre-existent word, this idea that Jesus truly was God, and there was no argument to be had there. This is just a random historical aside, but I just love this. Athanasius was a professional arguer. We aren't going to get into all of this, but in the I think 3 decades that he was bishop in Alexandria, he was exiled, I think, no fewer than 5 times by varying leaders, emperors, things along those lines. He was sort of a professional troublemaker, so to speak. And he has the great nickname Athanasius contra mundum, which is Athanasius against the world. So, maybe we can all aspire to be such a rabble rouser that we get a nickname like that. But in any case, Arius and Athanasius were kind of the two sides at play as we enter into the Council of Nicaea. Athanasius's view, as will not surprise you, given what we profess as a church today, was the outright winner. Outright, you see, 316-2, and Arius and Arianism was pretty roundly rejected at this council. This council would also produce the Nicene Creed, which was, since the Apostles' Creed, one of kind of this sort of major unifying creeds that united all of Christianity. This movement that in the destruction of Jerusalem had not had this sort of organized central authority. The Council of Nicaea really represents a coalescing of that. There was authority, as we've talked about, with the episcopal sees, but this really, across the Roman Empire, began to be this coalescing and coming together. Despite this, though, we know from the rest of the 4th century and the fact that they need to come back to this controversy about 50 years later, Arianism continued to be a big deal within the church of this time period. And there were continued fights on this in the century ahead. So as for Constantine and other reforms that he did, in the year 331, so this is nearing the end of his life and reign, he commissioned the creation of 50 Bibles for the use of churches in Constantinople. And it's believed that this may have been one of the real pushes that would eventually lead to the canonization of the New Testament. That this desire to make these authoritative, definitive Bibles was really kind of the final push of something that had long been running within Christianity. And Constantine, until his death in 337, continued to be somewhat of an advocate for Christianity. You may have heard the historical snippet that he was baptized on his deathbed, and you may have heard that quoted as a reason for why he was seen as sort of a hesitant convert. That piece actually isn't a huge thing, in that it was a sort of funny custom at the time that many Christians would delay their baptisms until what they hoped would be the last moment, so that all their sins would be washed away. It was sort of, they're trying to do a sort of cheat code, as it were, of having baptism wash away all the sins they had committed. And so as far as we know, all he was trying to do was observe that custom of whatever sins he may have committed as emperor. He wanted all those to be washed away on his deathbed. A curious little note here, and this gets into, again, the question of how serious he was. The priest who baptizes him, Eusebius of Nicodemia, was a very vocal proponent of Arianism, which was the very thing that his council that he convened was trying to fight against, and yet this was the person who baptized him. What we're to make of that, I'm not entirely sure. It may have been a baptism by convenience, since he was on his deathbed and they just needed anyone. But it is kind of a strange piece from someone who wanted to bring unity, and yet he invited the sort of enemy faction to baptize him. I don't know what to make of that, but in any case, we don't get a window into what he was thinking. As far as his legacy, before I kind of close and do a quick summary of where we've been, that 4th century would see the Roman Empire make an amazing pivot on Christianity. It started in 300 and 303 specifically as outright persecution, and by the end of it, it would become outright embrace. In the year 380, a subsequent emperor officially made Christianity the state religion of the entire Roman Empire. And Arian Christianity, non-Trinitarian Christianity is another way to think of it. They're wrong at the Council of Constantinople. And this led to the destruction of many of Arius's works and the exiling of many Arian priests. So, to sum up, we've been on quite a journey over these past 3 classes. So I think, I know sometimes the historical details, I mean, there's so many fascinating things. I love that. But for me, one of the reasons I find this so fascinating is when you zoom all the way out and just consider where we began on Pentecost with where this journey ultimately ends in that 4th century. So in the year 30, you have Jesus killed under the watch of Pontius Pilate, who was the Roman governor. This was a very small movement within Judea. Judea was was Roman occupied. They had had this brief period of independence that was essentially squashed by Rome. And objectively looking at it, you could say that Rome once again just kind of squashed this. They killed the leader of what we would know as the Christian movement. It's amazing. And even subsequently, if you take the book of Acts talking about Jesus' followers on Pentecost being around 120 people, you know, whether you give or take more on that number, if you take it at 120 people, we are talking about, what is that? It might even be less than 2 trillionths of the Roman Empire's population at that time. If you just stop and think about what an incredibly small percentage that Christians were as we move beyond the year 30. The fact that those subsequent years saw church disputes, like the relationship between Judaism and Christianity, that you saw the early center of the Christian movement destroyed 4 decades after Jesus' death, that there would be periods of persecution, whether it was Nero or others, whether it was these sort of outright fights between Gnostic Christianity and Proto-Orthodox Christianity. In 250, the fact that if you were Christian and held to that against Rome, that you would be executed and put to death, that took place not just once, not twice, but again 3 times in the year 303. And that during this time, much of the leadership and bishops were being killed. I will let you determine whether or not you see that as a miracle about where the church ended up. But at the very least, it is downright remarkable that despite all of that, despite being 2 trillionths of a percent of Rome's population, that there were around 6 million people by the year 300, that in the year 313, a Roman emperor officially, or at minimum, even if he wasn't serious, he felt it was important to publicly declare that he was a follower of Jesus. And that by the year 380, that the world's largest empire, estimated to be about 1/4 of the world's population, became Christian. When you step back and think about in the span of 350 years, just what an incredible thing that all of that is. I mean, it really, to me, speaks to the providential nature in which God was kind of overseeing this growth. It speaks to the impact that people's faith had, not just on them, but on their communities. And it speaks to the power of Jesus's message and that sort of sense of transformation. To think that a group who had their leader killed, that they scattered in the wake of that killing, that would be a small band of people, most of whom were fishermen or not sort of leaders, that would become the state religion of the Roman Empire. it's just truly astonishing. And so for me, that is part of my interest and passion in this, is just, it truly is one of the more remarkable things historically, I think, that has ever occurred, that you go from this small movement to a global church, so to speak. So with that, I think we're getting close to 1:30. I did see that there was a question in the chat, and happy to answer that. So I'll read the question because I know not everyone can see that. So there's a question about Constantine's mother, and was she Christian before she was? She seems to have made a name for herself, although she was not a theologian. Yeah, so that is actually a very interesting piece, and something that is somewhat up for debate. We do know that Constantine's mother was absolutely a very public Christian, at minimum in the wake of Constantine, sort of declaring his allegiance to Christianity. Unfortunately, it's not clear whether that was part of his upbringing or not. It's not out of the realm of question that she would have been an adherent to Christianity. As far as we know, she, particularly for kind of Roman circles, would have been seen as being among kind of lower class people, and so that, I suppose, increases the likelihood that she may have either been aware of Christianity or may have even been Christian herself. But yeah, I mean, maybe that speaks to the power that passing down one's faith to their children can have on the world. I mean, I don't know. It's sort of unclear historically whether or not that was the case, but it certainly seems plausible. So that's a great question. As a wait for other questions, I did receive a question this week about what eventually led to the split between the Roman Catholic Church and what we now know as kind of Orthodox. I mean, there are many Orthodox churches now, but what would become the Orthodox Church and its many offshoots. And so part of that did, I think, have its sort of roots in this split that Constantine made, moving his capital from Rome to Constantinople. It's sort of this west-east kind of position that he created. When the western half of the Roman Empire fell with the Goths and Visigoths, those invasions, Eastern Christianity really continued to flourish. Western Christianity would recover, obviously. But these two traditions, while they still met for councils, they did develop somewhat along parallel tracks to some degree. There was coherence between the two. But over time, there increasingly began to be questions about power and authority, leading to a somewhat comical situation in, I'm pretty sure it was the year 1056 off the top of my head, in which there was a dispute about the type of bread that would be used in communion. One wanted unleavened bread, the other wanted leavened bread. I forget which was which. So these were the bishops of Constantinople and the Bishop of Rome, so the two most powerful leaders within the Christian movement. So one wanted one and one wanted the other. The result was that the Bishop of Constantinople wrote a letter to the Bishop of Rome saying that he was excommunicated, and the Bishop of Rome wrote back saying, "Oh yeah, well, I'm going to excommunicate you." And so we have this almost like childish situation in which these two, you could call them popes, are mutually excommunicating one another. What probably is at play is that there was a dispute about who ultimately had authority. You have these really strong, prominent, the Church of Rome, the Church of Constantinople. Both of these were really incredible, important centers within Christianity. And, I guess they just hit a point where they wanted to mutually excommunicate one another. Curiously enough, there was not sort of a formal break in relations between the two. This excommunication of leaders just sort of hung there for a period of years. But from that moment on, the two traditions really began to diverge to a large degree. And so that moment of mutual excommunication is really, it's called the Great Schism. It was the first of what we now know as many breaks within Christianity. All right, looking again at the chat. What was the next council after Nicaea? I believe it was the Council of Chalcedon. I may not be pronouncing that correctly. But again, it was a return to the Arian controversy and sort of a doubling down on the position that was the council. Yeah, no, I'm starting to lose my mind. The Council of Nicaea. So that there were other issues at play, but that was again really one of the primary drivers. That was also really, I believe, was where the official canon of the New Testament was put into place. But please do your own research on that, because we're starting to inch into the era of history that I am not an expert in by any means. So please do your own research on that.
Fred, did you have a question?
Yeah, not to be too macabre, Matt, but you showed a great kind of Sunday school picture of lions and frightened Christians.
Yeah.
Was that the method of choice, or how did they persecute?
The primary method of choice, lions, no. There were certainly instances in which Christians were sort of used as sport within the Colosseums. It should be noted, though, that was actually a practice. It wasn't just Christians. They would also do the same with criminals and others as well. But there was this growing sense within kind of the aristocracy that this was a really barbaric practice. And that started to be phased out to some degree. Believe it or not, I hope I'm remembering this correctly. I thought even Diocletian wasn't a terribly big fan of it and wanted to phase it out. Having said that, his method of choice was no better. Burning was very common, unfortunately. So people being burned, as well as just execution by having one's head chopped off. Those were probably the quickest, and I don't think cleanest is the right term, but
Yeah, right. Not exactly clean.
I guess the most efficient, as it were. And so one of the other challenges of this, honestly, is that there is this whole subgenre of celebrating martyrs within the Christian church that, as you read them, they are almost certainly playing up the details a little bit, and it can sometimes be hard to tell what was. I'll just use this term, a lionized version of the martyrdom versus what actually happened. It can be really hard to tell. I think in our first class, I talked about the legend of Peter getting beheaded, and that his head, every time it bounced, created a fountain that sprang up from the earth. I mean, I feel fairly confident in saying that didn't happen, but these are the sorts of tales that spring up. And it can sometimes be hard to tell exactly what was going on. So, yeah.
Thanks.
All right. Any other questions? All right.
All right.
I just want to say, I can't believe we did this. We made it from the year 30 to 330, 300 years of history in 3 classes. I was a little nervous when I posed this, but there we are.
This is a challenge for next class you teach.
Yeah, I say I got to up the stakes. So
Yeah, 900 years maybe.
yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you, everyone. This was a great class. I learned a lot, and I want to thank Matt for. I'm tired. I want to go nap because it's exhausting. But thank you, Matt, for all your help on this. It was fascinating stuff.
No, absolutely. Thank you to you all. Thanks. I'm glad we could get through the earlier audio problems, and no, just by and large, really appreciate you all being willing to stick with it and to learn about a lesser known period of church history that I see as being incredibly important. So,
Yeah. Can you send us the presentation?
yes, absolutely. I'll again send it to Michael. All those, and I don't know where those get posted, but yes, absolutely.
All right. Thank you.
Man.
Thank
Yep.
you.
All
Thank you.
Awesome.
Okay.
All right.
Thank
Take care,
you.
all. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
All
Thank
right,
you.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.